Well, there was an official song, which I don't think anyone outside of Italy heard, which was done by Edoardo Bennato and Gianni Nannini, who are two very big rock stars in Italy.
Notte Magiche, il seguendo gol, sotto il cielo di un'estate italiana.
You are listening to the Cycling Podcast at our Giro d'Italia, brought to you by iWalkup, flexible loans built for small businesses. Today, we are in Calvanico.
Kotze čitene kotze, kotze pištine, nuspiku dešikora, nuspiku dešikora, kotze čitene kotze, kotze pištine, nuspiku dešikora, se non mangiano le femmine.
Where are we, Lionel?
We are in the shadow of Rifugio Calvanico, the Zoncolan of the south, the mythical, not pretend mountain, is it? We'll hear a little bit more about that shortly. Stage 9 of our Giro, the last one before a little rest day. Looking forward to a rest day.
Yeah, how are your legs, Lionel?
They're still in one piece, just about. But
mine are in bits.
Our Giro is, I'm targeting the Intergiro. Trying to make it halfway each day. It's still tough.
I've been getting some flack in the press, I know, as race director, but I'm trying not to. I'm trying to stay focused on the job, and I'm trying not to pay too much attention to, you know, what the what was the phrase? The critics and the skeptics are saying.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I believe in the miracle of me finishing our Giro. At this point in the other Giro, Maroveni's normally getting stick for lots of really boring stages, isn't he? But not our Daniele Friebe. There's nothing boring about our stages so far, if you're riding them, that is.
I'm hoping there'll be all sorts of privileges and blandishments come my way as a result of being the director of our Giro. I was watching, when I was researching our episode on Cipollini, I saw there's a clip on YouTube of Cipollini and Maroveni attending a white truffle symposium together, as you do.
That sounds great. Well, that takes me neatly on to Lionel. What's coming up in tonight's episode? That's actually one for you, Daniel, before we get to Tail of the Tapper. What is coming up tonight?
Well, Rich, I think we heard in our intro a little hint of what's coming, a very famous Italian song. We're going to talk more about the magic nights, the magic days, what they are, what they were later. We're basically going to be going back to 1990, the summer of 1990, heady days, giddy days for Italy, for Gianni Bugno, the winner of the Giro d'Italia, the leader of the Giro, from stage 1 to the end of the race in Milan. Only man to do that, I think.
Incorrect, Daniel. If you've been listening to last week's podcast, I ran through Eddy
Merckx.
Merckx.
I hadn't finished my sentence.
Oh.
I hadn't finished my sentence.
Well, if you've been listening to our Stars and Water Carriers episode, you'd have
since
heard...
Merckx.
Oh, right,
Only
okay,
man
sorry.
to do that since Merckx.
Well rescued.
I wasn't listening to you. 4 have done it in total, haven't they? Led from start to finish.
That's right. Only 2 in the pink jersey, though. Merckx and Bugno, the only 2 to actually do it in the era of the pink jersey.
What was the biggest song of 1990, in the UK at least?
Nessun Dorma.
Nothing Compares to You by Sinead O'Connor, with Vogue by Madonna in second. Tail of the Tapper, please, Lionel.
Well, we need to go back into the vault for today's Tale of the Tapper because, as I said, we're at Rifugio Calvanico, and we were there in person a couple of years ago, weren't we, Daniel?
We were.
Amarcord. I remember...
What are we doing?
I want to show you something, Lionel.
But this isn't anywhere near the Giro.
I know, we're off the route, but get out the car.
But it's raining.
Get out.
Oh, I don't...
Handbrake on.
Yeah. I don't like in charge, Daniel. What?
I brought you, Lionel, to the Zoncolan.
Oh, no, even I know this isn't the Zoncolan.
It's the Zoncolan of the south. We're at the foot. We're in a place called Calvanico. And this is, well, the climb that we can see in front of us that you're about to describe, the mountain you're about to describe, is where the Zoncolan of the south begins its journey.
Well, I would describe it, but it's shrouded in cloud at the moment. How much higher does it go than there? I mean, it looks quite mountainous, but it doesn't look as impressive as mountains in the north, I wouldn't say.
We're in the Monti Picentini, so we're just to the east of Salerno, not far from Naples. And, the climb we're talking about goes up to just over 1,000 metres above sea level.
Well, it's nothing like the Zoncolan then, is it?
Well, it's nothing like the Zoncolan, but it's also nothing like what was advertised, mythologized, speculated about. In 2011, there were a series of newspaper reports and stories broken on an internet newspaper called Info Oggi, but then it subsequently went on to appear in Tutto Sport, in various cycling magazines, Il Mattino, a local newspaper, that the 2012 Giro was going to feature the Zoncolan of the south, and that was the Rifugio Calvanico. The problem was that the climb they were talking about was 7.8 kilometres long, 13% average. It was going to be the hardest climb ever to feature in a Grand Tour. However, it didn't exist, or it didn't exist in the form that people thought it existed in. And there was a Facebook group started. There were letters sent to the local mayor of Calvanico. There was a mischievous grin from the then Giro boss Angelo Zomagnan when the Rifugio Calvanico and the Zoncolan of the south was mentioned, and everyone was ready for it to be unveiled at the 2012 Giro route presentation, but it wasn't. And I actually came up here not long after that to try and investigate. I was writing a book called Mountain High. I wanted to know what this Rifugio Calvanico was. I spent about a day here asking for directions, asking people what this climb was, where it was, and it turned out it didn't really exist. Something vaguely similar existed. It's now raining pretty heavily. It was a climb to a santuario, a religious sanctuary of San Michele, Pizzo di San Michele, but it was not as high as people thought it was. It was not quite as steep, and it was in no condition to host even a village kermesse, let alone the Giro d'Italia.
So let me get this straight. It's not an average percentage of 13%. It's not 7.8.
It was 11%. And I actually did climb it on a bike, but it was about 7 kilometres long, 11% average. But it's never going to appear in the Giro.
So did we get to the bottom of why this story even existed? Was it some kind of internet myth or somebody, a bit like when people post completely made up transfer rumours on football forums, and then it appears in the Sun and it turns out that the player doesn't even exist? Is it
correct? It was exactly that. It was an internet based whispering campaign, and Mauro Vegni, who is now the Giro boss but was then the Giro route director, I spoke to him about the Rifugio Calvanico and the Zoncolan in the south, and he says that there are 60 million people in Italy and 60 million people who want to design a Giro route. They all think it's like they all want to be the Italian football team manager. They all think they know the best team, and he says he gets thousands of suggestions for climbs to use, and dozens of people have claimed that they've found the Zoncolan of the south or the east of the west, and that was one of it was a case like that.
I imagine whoever invented this mountain and started this story probably felt quite satisfied when it pitched up in national newspapers and magazines. I know,
and a book, and four pages were dedicated to it in a book called Mountain Higher.
Yeah, but you were debunking the myth rather than going along with it. I mean, it's something the Cycling Podcast tried years ago when starting the rumour that Geraint Thomas was going to join BMC.
We've started lots of those rumours. Well, Napalm, I've got quite fond memories of that little detour we made to Rifugio Calvanico. We said, when you were asked, where are we today? I think you were asked, where are we today? That's what we usually do. You said we're at Rifugio Calvanico. I wouldn't fancy sleeping there. I think the only people that used to sleep there or have ever slept there are bandits and brigands, and so the legend goes, quite a remote part of southern Italy. But don't think, as we discussed there, don't think the real Giro will ever finish up there. But our Giro is finishing up there, and I'm sure you can have a great time grovelling up to the Zoncolan of the south.
Well, let's go over to the course and see how our knees are getting on climbing up the Zoncolan of the south. It looks steep from the profile. It's all an angry red and orange colour. I expect I'll be an angry red and orange colour when we go over to the course, as we will now.
Well, there's nothing mythical about the Zoncolan of the south. I can confirm that. I'm on the lower slopes, only 4.3 kilometres to go, but it's at 19%. I've been joined by quite a lot of other riders. Lionel was on the ride today. At the same time, shout out to Hannah Cook. who I've been riding with quite a bit. Barry Mooney, Dave Owen, Alan McIntyre, Charlie Richards, David Keenan. Also for Martin Perkins, who was on the ride today. Well done, Martin. Well done, everyone who's finished today. A few of you have been waving and stuff as you've gone past. Could be a few DNFs today. I think everyone's looking forward to a rest day tomorrow. Anyway, back to our Giro.
You are listening to the Cycling Podcast at our Giro d'Italia, brought to you by iWalkup, flexible loans built for small businesses. iwoca.co.uk.
I'm Giovanni. I work at iWalkup. I report in systems as a delivery manager. So I remember growing up in northern Italy. When I was a kid, it would happen every year. They would close all the main street of our city. You know, as a kid, I kind of struggled to understand why they needed to close all the city. It's actually quite a hassle. But the reality is it was always great when the day came around to go down with my father, just see these guys passing through so fast, so athletic, in eclectic colors. The bikes look extremely technological and, you know, you could see innovation and sport together. And I think that was part of what always attracted me.
Thanks very much indeed to our title sponsor, iWalkup. Very grateful to them for their support, and without them, we wouldn't be here at our Giro.
Vino del giorno. Chin chin.
So for our first steel table white of the cycling podcast, Our Giro, we've got the Manduria Zin Fiano from Puglia, which is a blend of 15% Fiano Minutolo and 85% straight Fiano. Now, this particular wine for me really shows some apple and some pear flavours, but with a delicate orange blossom sort of aroma in the background. It really yields a sort of nice structure that works well with chicken, pork, and some of your bigger seafood dishes. A real summer favourite here at our store at the moment, and extremely popular. I hope you enjoyed as well. Thanks.
Taken our Giro to Puglia for the purposes for enological purposes, so that we could have this nice Pugliese white. The Fiano is made from the Fiano grape. Thoughts?
This wine, Daniel, is not nice.
What?
It's spectacular.
Lovely stuff. Yeah, it's quite green on the nose. Reminded me a little bit of a Sauvignon Blanc on the nose. Bit, maybe not sort of the gooseberry type flavours of a Sauvignon Blanc, but yeah, nice acidity.
Very tangy. Very tangy.
Tangy. I can see you're really warming to this, Rich.
One thing I'd like to say is that in case anyone's wondering, the Cycling Podcast has no commercial interest in this Wine of the Day feature. Divine Cellars are selling our Giro cases of wine, and proceeds from those sales will go to the Scuola Ciclismo Cene, for which we are raising money. But this feature exists purely to humiliate me. It's the heir to the Lionel Learns Italian feature from a couple of years ago.
We actually paid for our wine, didn't we? And very happy to do so. This is lovely. This is a real kind of little glass with a lovely light lunch. I don't have many lovely light lunches.
I would describe it as quite punchy, quite a punchy white wine.
Well, chaps, I said it was from Puglia. We are starting today's podcast. Well, we are in the Campania region, but today's stage started in Puglia, in a place called Altamura. And we started in Puglia because the 1990 Giro started in Puglia. That's what we're going to be talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, the 1990 Giro did start right down in Puglia and kind of just went straight up the country, didn't it, Daniel? Not many options otherwise, I guess, but it's funny to look at the map because we mentioned the other day how seldom the Giro actually starts or used to start in the south of Italy. It's far more common now.
It is, Rich, and Italy in 1990 was in a very good place. Italy was absolutely booming, and it's a period of time that's kind of mythologized in modern Italian history. Things had never really been better, and today we're going to be hearing a lot from our friend, the Italian scholar, Professor John Foote, author of several books about Italy. As mentioned in previous episodes of the podcast, pedalare, the history of the Italian cycling. Calcio, a book about Italian football. John's written a lot about Italian politics. I kicked off by asking John just to paint a picture for us of just how good things were in Italy in 1990.
It's very strange looking back, because I was living in Milan at that time, and you know what happens afterwards. So in 92, you've got the collapse coming, but in 90, no one thought that was going to happen. It really felt like there'd been a very long boom. The 80s had been a boom time for Italy. A lot of money around, financial boom, a lot of kind of new money. Got the sort of Berlusconi media kind of stuff going on. The same old parties were in power, and it really felt like this is, Italy was a really great place to be, and you've got the World Cup. And so, everyone's looking at Italy and thinking, and it really, that World Cup was immensely influential for Italian culture, I think, in the world, or what people thought was Italian culture. So, yeah, it's just really weird to think about 1990 and then think that very early in 92, the whole thing's going to come absolutely crashing down in every single way. But it just no one thought that was going to. You still got Andreotti prime minister. I mean, Andreotti is still prime minister. It's just unbelievable. It's really like nothing's changed politically since the post-war period, and there's money everywhere. People have got 2-3 cars. They're going on holiday. They've got second homes. It's booming. We're talking about a second economic miracle in the 80s. The first one is really the 50s and 60s, but you have a second one in the 80s, which is really based on a whole series of different kind of industries, particularly fashion, design, small businesses, very specialised things in the Northeast. You're making things like bicycle seats and ski boot bits and things like that, sunglasses, that kind of business, export, high-level export, fashion. It's the second boom. There's a lot of finance capital around. So even more money is made in the second boom. The first one was really about taking people from peasants to workers. And this one takes people from workers to small business people, entrepreneurs, and it raises the level of the Italian economy. So if you're looking for quality clothing, if you're looking for quality design, you go to Italy in that. You still do to some extent, but all the big fashion industries, the 5 of the top 6 fashion industries in the world are based in Milan in the 80s. And you can reel them off. I'm sure everybody knows they're household names. It's a fascinating period. I think Milan is leading it to a large extent. Milan, again, like it was before the virus hit, is kind of pulling the rest of Italy along in this moment. And then ahead of all this, you've got this amazing political figure, Bettino Craxi, who's this very modern, strong man. I think a lot of what's come afterwards, he'd anticipated. First Socialist Party was like the 3rd biggest party in Italy, but was incredibly influential as the middle of the sort of 2 big parties, the Communists and the Christian Democrats, and they'd gone with the Christian Democrats. And he was Prime Minister for 4 years in the 80s, and a very strong leader, very much detached himself from the left. You can see all this coming later with Blair, years later, but he'd actually got a red rose instead of the hammer and sickle as the party symbol. He'd done loads of things that happened later. I think Italy often anticipates these things. Quite modern political actor. But of course, down below, completely corrupt and completely selling away the state assets of Italy to enormous debt. So it's kind of built on sand, this boom, very much.
We heard from John Foote there, and we've mentioned his book Pedalare a lot. It's been a bit of a Bible for me, this book, when it comes to Italian cycling. But at some point towards the end of what is an excellent account of all the great characters and races in Italian cycling history, he writes, "This history should really end here in January 1984, with the scientific concoctions being prepared by Francesco Moser and his team of doctors for his world hour record attempt in Mexico City. The history should end at some point in the 1980s and 1990s for one simple reason. From here on, this is no longer a book about cycling. Most of the rest of this volume will deal not with stories of great climbs or sprints or punctures or breakaways. Rather, we enter a shadowy world of blood transfusions, hormones, testosterone, cocaine, arrests, protests, masking agents, police swoops, and sacks of blood in Spanish fridges. This is the murky world of medically inspired cheating, with its tales of the extraordinary extent which people will go to win or just to participate.
Wow, way to bring us down. Everything was good. You know, we were talking about swinging Milan and, you know, everything being well with Italy, and then you dragged us down.
John Foot's fault.
Well, it is John Foot's fault, but it's true. It's an interesting period as well in Italian cycling, because we're about to get to all of that, all the nastiness. But before the nastiness came great prosperity, but not until the early 90s, did it? Because the Italians were suffering at the end of the 80s, particularly in stage races. I was staggered to realise, and I knew that Italian cycling in the 80s became quite parochial. The big rivalry was Saronni-Moser, neither of whom thrived really in the Tour de France. But I didn't realise how parochial it was. They didn't have, the Italians, a single top 10 finisher in the Tour de France between 1980 and 1989.
And yet, there were odd anomalies. I mean, Maurizio Fondres was one, but more consistently Moreno Argentin in one-day races. It all kind of came to a crescendo, appropriately enough, given Gianni Bugno, who we're going to talk about later, his links to classical music, which we'll hear about, I'm sure. But Argentin was riding high, and Marco Giovanetti also won the Vuelta a España, didn't he? So things changed very quickly for Italian cycling, it seemed.
And against that backdrop, Rich, so Gianni Bugno was a promising amateur, but nothing, you know, there was no one really talking about Bugno as a sort of future phenomenon when he was an amateur. Got an interesting sort of backstory. He was born in Brugg in Switzerland. Another rider who was born in Switzerland, Jakob Fuglsang, born in Geneva. Gianni Bugno was born in Switzerland. His family, I think, quite sort of humble, working class stock. A lot of Italians, or quite a number of Italians, moved to Switzerland in, I guess it would have been the 60s, moved to Switzerland. And when Bugno himself was born, the parents actually were about to move back, and they moved to Monza, which is a suburb of Milan. But Gianni, for the first 4 years of his life, he spent most of the time with his paternal grandparents, certainly his grandparents, who lived at the bottom of Monte Grappa. And he was pretty much raised for the first 4 years by his grandparents. And then when he was about 4, his parents, as I say, had gone back to Monza. They'd opened a laundrette, and he went back to live with his parents and grew up there, and was not really particularly interested in or good at any sports, but then discovered cycling, I think in his early teens, and made his way, and eventually turned professional for the Atala team. Atala, the famous, a lot of people will be familiar with their blue and grey stripes, wasn't it? Horizontal striped jersey. Yeah,
I mean, there was nothing in the first 4 years of his career that suggested Grand Tour champion material, was there? He'd ridden the Giro the first time in 86 and finished 41st. He didn't finish in 87 or 88. He joined the Chateau d'Ax team in 1988 and won a stage of the Tour de France into Limoges that year, but it certainly wasn't someone that you would have thought was going to win a Giro or a Tour de France, and of course ended up on the podium a couple of times in the Tour. This was all to come, of course. Won on Alpe d'Huez twice, won back-to-back World Championships, so clearly something happened around about the age 26, 27. He was 26 going into this 1990 Giro. An unlikely superstar, really, wasn't he? I mean, Chateau d'Ax was a home furnishings company selling all sorts of things for, dining tables and sofas and stuff. And Gianni Bugno had the look of a sort of, home furnishings store salesman, really, didn't he? Neat haircut, smart, sensible Diodora shoes on the bike. Not the kind of stereotypical, Italian cyclist blessed with a lot of kind of panache and flair. I wouldn't have thought, just from those kind of, early glimpses of him.
No, very sort of laconic and almost a kind of downtrodden air about him, very deep voice, didn't say an awful lot. And then those first couple of years of his career, his pro career, I mean, people had started to sort of say about him that he had a lot of class and that he was someone who could go far, but he was already starting to kind of frustrate people. In 1988, the Giro had a bad crash and a descent, and this led to various problems with descending, and labyrinthitis he also suffered from, and he eventually cured that famously by listening to Mozart, or he had some kind of acoustic therapy.
That's the story that was told, wasn't it, in 1990 when Bugno did emerge that year, winning Milan San Remo and then the Giro, and really as Lionel sort of hinted at, a kind of different rider. And there were kind of various explanations offered for his apparent transformation. And classical music was one of them. I quoted from Sam Abd's book the other day. And again, you know, Sam wrote a chapter about him in 1990, that Bugno was remade by psychologists, allergists, racing counsellors, and of course his musical therapist. I mean, it's easy to, you know, raise an eyebrow at some of that, but I think his record from there on showed his class. I mean, I remember people really sort of purring in delight at the spectacle of Bugno on a bike at his best.
He almost had a sort of purring motion on the bike.
Yeah,
I mean, he pawed the pedals. You know, and he kind of looked as though he had one eye half open when he was doing so, as though he was almost falling asleep on the bike.
We'll talk about that 1990 Giro in the next part, and about, you know, some of the riders he had to beat. But yeah, his upper body was rock solid, almost as if he was sort of holding it like that for a bet or something.
Almost Tonkov-esque.
He was even more solid than Tonkov, I would say. I mean, for me, it looked unnatural. It looked kind of strange, kind of odd. Only his legs moved. That was it.
Looking back, I mean, knowing what we know now and knowing what he was about to accomplish in that 1990 season, he was almost a perfect hero for Italian cycling. This Italian cycling kind of emerging from the doldrums, and as I said, an Italy that was very sort of pleased with itself, walking around with its kind of chest puffed out, and with the World Cup, the Football World Cup, about to arrive. They'd won a bid for the World Cup in 1984. It was about to happen. And I think, as we're about to hear a bit more of from John Foot now, it was going to be a sort of festival of everything that Italy had accomplished over the previous 10 years.
There was a kind of lot of partying going on. There was a lot of coke being snorted. There was a lot of discos. You know, it was the phrase that people use for that period is this phrase "Milano da bere," which came from an advert for a drink called Ramazzotti, and it was a picture of Milan with a bottle of Ramazzotti. And this is kind of, people had money. They were going out. There was a lot of sex and drugs and rock and roll going on, and it was some of this was through football celebrity and Berlusconi and that kind of stuff. And yes, it was kind of like the sort of last days of Pompeii in many ways, but it didn't feel like that at the time. It felt like this is going to go on forever. And, you know, that the money was just going to keep flowing and flowing and flowing. A lot of the building and the developments, the money that was spent on that World Cup was astronomical. And a lot of it went not onto the stadiums, but into people's pockets. And in fact, the disaster that comes afterwards starts with people being arrested because of dodgy, you know, stadium building schemes, there was a tube station in Rome that was used for a week, you know, there were things like that. Even though money was flowing into this infrastructure, when it wasn't, a lot of it was going to the mafia and the Camorra and the politicians, and it wasn't going to the actual stadium, a lot of which turned out to be disasters in terms of what was actually built. So, yeah, there was very much a castle of sand, which felt amazing at the time, but was storing up a lot of trouble for later. And there was a sense that, you know, we should just this is going to be a great window on the world, so let's not, you know, be too critical. It really started to happen quite soon after the tournament finished. The other thing that's very interesting around that time is that although the big scandal is 92, you get the seeds of the disintegration of the system are already there in 90. And particularly, I think, the Lega Nord, which is already starting to, you know, make an impact around then. Lega Nord is a regionalist party, movement, not more than a party, which starts to emerge in the late 80s against the system. And, you know, and it's very racist not just against immigrants from outside of Italy, racist against Southerners as well. It's a northern movement. And they start to kind of knock down the system, you know, and attack the politicians in a very rhetorical way. Once again, Italy, the building trends, all this stuff. Oh, populism. Yeah, this is 1990, right? This is not 5 minutes, not Trump or even Berlusconi. They're ahead of the game on that. So I think those seeds are already there, and, you know, the system just wasn't sustainable. But no one at that time, or people were starting to say it, but most of the time, a lot of people so many people were inside the system that they couldn't see any alternative to it.
The Cycling Podcast at Our Giro d'Italia is supported by Science in Sport. Science in Sport, fueled by science.
Thank you very much to our longest standing supporter, sponsor, Science and Sport, who first backed us at the 2016 Giro d'Italia, and they're still with us to this day. Never been more useful for me. I don't know about you, Lionel, but riding our Giro every day, I've been shoveling Science and Sport products down my gob.
I would like to think you're wolfing down a full plate of spaghetti on the turbo train, a la Gianni Motta in 1966, or the pictures of Merckx having done that, Cipollini as well.
Yeah, but if Science and Sport had been around in the 1960s, then Gianni Motta would have been having energy bakes in a variety of flavours. The big discovery for me is the performance nitrate, and I've been I shouldn't say this, of course, but I've no idea when to eat this and consume this stuff. I'm just shoveling it in, especially a few nights ago on the stage to Etna. I started having hunger knock about 20 minutes into the ride, and I just got as much as I could, and I finished the ride in a pool of sweat and empty Science and Sport wrappers floating in my pool of sweat.
What
anyway,
a lovely image.
If you'd like 25% off your Science and Sport products, go to scienceandsport.com and enter the code SISCP25. SISCP25.
I'd like 25% off the distance of our Giro, if that's possible, but probably too late for that, isn't it? But anyway,
you can reduce as you well know, Lionel, you can reduce the severity of the incline by at least 25%, should you wish.
You can also reduce your weight either by cheating or eating a bit less.
Well,
cheating sounds a lot easier. Anyway, moving on to the 1990 Giro d'Italia. Put it in context. You mentioned that there had been 3 overseas winners in the years leading up to that. 87 was Stephen Roche, of course. 88 was Andy Hampsten, who we're going to hear from in a future episode, and 89 was Laurent Fignon, and he went back in 1990 probably as a favourite. I mean, he obviously lost the Tour narrowly to Greg LeMond the previous year, but he was probably the favourite going into that Giro, would you say, Daniel?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's interesting. I think people only understood with hindsight how much he'd been traumatised by what happened in the 89 Tour, but he was the defending champion, and he was the guy who most people consider the favourite for the 1990 Giro. Bugno wasn't on anyone's radar. He'd done 6 Grand Tours. He failed to finish 2 of them. His best finish in a Grand Tour had been 11th up to that point. LeMond was also in the field, but LeMond, he had said that he didn't have big ambitions himself, and he was mainly training. There wasn't much else. Teunissen, the Dutch rider, he had a positive test hanging over his head, and there was actually going to be a rider protest on stage 6.
I mean, that surprised me. I think the positive test was from April, wasn't it? And it was unresolved. He had numerous positive tests in his career, Gert-Jan Teunissen, but that surprised me. The riders were going to protest against his participation. Is that correct? I mean, that kind of surprises me for that era.
That is correct, Rich. That protest, I think, happened on stage 6. But just going back to the start of the race, it was going to start, the Giro starting in Bari, in Puglia, so the heel of the Italian stiletto. But the start of the Giro itself was even overshadowed, certainly as far as the sports newspapers were concerned, because there was a huge story, which was a football story, but it wasn't to do with the World Cup. Roberto Baggio, who was sort of footballing sensation in the world at the time, had left Fiorentina and was signing for Juventus. I can't remember, Napalm, whether it was a world record fee. But anyway, there were riots for days in Florence as a result of that transfer. And, well, it made Roberto Baggio world famous, that move. And of course, everyone, even years later, had heard of Roberto Baggio, hadn't they? We're surrounded by signed Del Piero jerseys, Roberto Baggio. Those names say anything to you?
Not much, to be honest. I won't lie.
Well, Chris Froome obviously hadn't heard of Roberto Baggio even now. Remarkable. But I suppose he was only 5 and he was living in Africa, so perhaps wasn't watching the World Cup. Probably didn't know who Gianni Bugno was at the time either, did he? To be fair.
No. Probably.
I mean, I think a lot of riders complain now that they still don't know who Gianni Bugno is because he's head of the Riders' Union.
Of course, Baggio's nickname was the Divine Ponytail. But was Fignon sporting a ponytail in 1990?
He was. Yes.
Yeah, nothing divine about that.
But Fignon, well, he didn't start particularly well, although he was the favourite. Bugno did start well. He won the prologue in Bari, and I think he put half a minute into Fignon, but no one really thought that was a sign that he was going to win the race. There was a mountain stage coming just 3 days into the race on Vesuvius, and people thought that, Bugno could possibly keep the jersey there, and that's exactly what he ended up doing.
Bugno all'attacco. Hanno perso contatto tutti I diretti avversari e Gianni Bugno, il vincitore della Milano-Sanremo del Giro del Trentino, il primo in classifica generale, va ancora all'attacco. Bravissimo.
Penso che fa quello che doveva fare, perché tanto gli altri devono faticare come lui e tra 2 chilometri la corsa è finita.
So, Daniel, that was stage 3 that finished on Mont Vesuvius. Eduardo Chozas, Spanish rider, won. Gianni Bugno was second, 26 seconds behind. And Chozas was the early kind of contender to challenge Bugno. But who was that gravelly-voiced co-commentator on the Italian TV commentary there?
That was none other than Gino Bartali, Ginetaccio, who I discovered had a heart operation a couple of days before the start of the Giro, but still took his place in the commentary box. And I think there was a bit of a theme in that Giro of Bartali sort of criticising Bugno, or Bugno certainly thought so.
We mentioned that, didn't we, in episode 1, and we will be looking much more at Bartali and his rivalry with Coppi in a later episode. It kind of makes, when I think of Bartali, I think of the sort of distant past and black and white images, and yet the 1990 Giro to me feels quite recent, and so it's kind of hard to wrap my head around the fact that that's Bartali there, larger than life, and critiquing Bugno at the 1990 Giro.
Talking of former riders being critical of their successors and the riders in that Giro, Greg LeMond, as we said, had sort of gone in thinking and talking about using it for training. Eddy Merckx was absolutely outraged by this, and he in the Italian press said that LeMond's performance was scandalous or shameful. LeMond, of course, had beaten Fignon in the Tour de France the previous year. Fignon didn't have a very auspicious start either, because he crashed on stage 5 to Teramo. That ended up really putting paid to his chances, and he stayed in the race, but he would pull out a few days later, and Bugno was really beginning to dominate. There was another mountain stage to a place called Vallombrosa in Tuscany, not far from Florence, and Bugno also won that one.
Bugno al comando, Bugno all'attacco, ed è Bugno che vince, ancora Bugno.
I mean, Bugno, pretty irresistible, winning the stage 1 time trial, second on stage 3, first on stage 7 there, and winning that one from a sprint in a group. Shades of Simon Yates in 2018. Would a 1990s vintage Daniel Friebe have been saying that he'd only actually won one Tirreno Adriatico at that point?
Well, it's funny you should say that, Rich, because a lot of the comments, you read back a lot of the comments from other riders in that Giro, and they were suggesting the same thing. They were saying, Marino Lejarreta, the Spanish rider, for example, said that Bugno was riding every day like a classic and that he was going to pay for it sooner or later. Fignon had said, this is Bugno's, this is his 15 minutes of fame. Let's let him enjoy it.
It is funny you mention Simon Yates, because on the day that we went to Rifugio Calvanico, where our virtual Giro is today, that was the day I coined the nickname the Flying Black Pudding, Il Sanguinaccio Volante. And I just wonder, would Bugno have been called the sofa salesman? What's that in Italian?
He would be the venditore di divani. No, he wouldn't.
The flying sofa salesman.
He did have a nickname. He had a nickname coined by none other than Gianni Mura, Punto, who we've talked a lot about in the last few weeks. And it was Gianni Vedremo Bugno. Vedremo being we'll see. The reason Gianni Mura came up with that nickname was that, not because, I initially thought it was because Bugno always used to say, we'll see, in response to questions, but it was more to do with Bugno's lack of consistency. So, and this was a nickname that Gianni Mura used to use in every piece, really, that he wrote about Bugno. He sort of permanently assigned this middle name to Gianni Bugno, so it was always Gianni Vedremo Bugno. The kind of irony being that in this Giro, he was extremely consistent.
Well, I have to say, I dare I say that I think Lionel's better at coming up with nicknames than Gianni Mura.
Wow.
Praise indeed for you there, Lionel.
Goodness me. It's not a nickname that Simon Yates really embraced, though, is it? Really, the flying black pudding. Understandably, I mean, it was meant in. I don't want to.
You wash your hands of it pretty sharply as well. Once you realised that
he kept bringing it up. People kept bringing it up in the press conferences, and I was just sinking into my chair, thinking,
don't shoot the messenger.
I mean, it was just some words that my brain came up with. Anyway, talking about Bugno and the kind of the let's see mentality. The time trial, stage 10 time trial, 68-kilometre individual time trial. I mean, that's that's not the sort of thing that happens quite so much these days, is it? But
sort of thing you get on our Giro, isn't it?
There'd be a big climb in it, though. I think it was quite flat that day. There would have been a 1,000-metre climb in there.
Bugno, basically, in the morning, he led the Polish rider Joachim Halupchuk by 1 minute 24. Bugno finished second on the stage to Luca Gelfi. By the end of the day, he led overall by 4 minutes and 8 seconds from Marco Giovannetti. And really, that's the moment that Bugno is suddenly not just in the driving seat, but he's got both hands on the wheel, and he's in charge of the direction of the race. I mean, Motte 4 minutes and 9 back, and then you look at the top 10, and they're just riders who you would pick as people who would finish in and around the kind of lower positions in the top 10, not people who are genuinely going to challenge for the pink jersey in the second half of the race. I mean, it's done and dusted from the halfway point, really.
Yeah, I think it was, Lionel, and if you look back at the comments that the other riders were starting to make at this point in the race, they were sort of talking about Bugno as a bit of an extraterrestrial. That I think Charlie Motte said that he was leading the Giro of the humans, of the normal riders behind him. But Bugno, by all accounts, he was very popular. He was becoming very popular with the Italian fans. He had appealed to for example, he'd become a bit of a spokesperson. He'd appealed to the Fiorentina fans to stop rioting about Roberto Baggio, and the Italian national football team, who was preparing for the World Cup, was apparently finishing training every day and all sort of piling into a changing room to watch Bugno and watch the Giro on the big screen. So there's this real sense that Italy's sort of passion for cycling, passion for the Giro was really being reawoken by Gianni Bugno. And, by that point, he had the Dolomites and the Alps, 3 or 4 stages between him and victory, and it was looking very, very good.
Ecco il Motte che vince. Motte, Charlie Motte su Gianni Bugno. Quindi Charlie Motte, poi rivedremo.
Well, that was the stage that went over the Pordoi. It also went over Val Gardena and the Marmolada on its way. Charlie Motte and Gianni Bugno were away together, weren't they? And took a couple of minutes out of everybody else, and many minutes out of the rest. And famous pictures from Graham Watson of Bugno and Motte together. That was the day that Marco Giovannetti, of course, Richard, you mentioned he'd won the Vuelta earlier in the spring. He'd been the second place rider up to that point, but then Charlie Motte leapfrogged him, and it was Bugno by just over 4 minutes from Motte by that stage, with the final 5 or 6 stages left to go.
And the next stage after the Passo Pordoi was going to Aprica, and it was the world premiere of the Mortirolo, but it was the Mortirolo from the easier side. So they were going down what is now considered the hard side to go up, and it was going to be everyone knew it was going to be a very dangerous descent. Bugno ended up coming through unscathed, although Gianni Bugno was very, very superstitious, and it was the 17th stage, and 17 is the unlucky number in Italy. In the UK, most countries, I think it's 13, but 17 is considered unlucky in Italy, and he was terrified that he was going to crash. And there was this incident before the stage where a TV cameraman he went to reassure Gianni Bugno, because he said to him, I'm accreditation number 17, Gianni, don't worry, nothing's going to happen to me, nothing's going to happen to you, it's all going to be fine. But Bugno was apparently very nervous about this. But that day became famous, not really because of what Bugno did, but because of what another rider, Leonardo Sierra, did. Leonardo Sierra, discovered by who?
Gianni Savio. Even I know that.
I discovered Leonardo Sierra in Tour of America, a stage race in Venezuela, Florida, and at the beginning of the season. My English is always very bad, because sorry, but I have no time to study well. This is the problem. Certo, ma allora, sai, qui era stato un po', c'era stata un po' di...
The story about me swapping him for 22 bikes wasn't quite true. Or at least there was a little bit of poetic license involved. Leonardo Sierra was in the Venezuelan national team, and the president of the Venezuelan National Federation asked me whether I'd like to go into partnership with them to help the development of Venezuelan cycling. He asked whether I could supply the national team's bikes. They needed 22 of them, and so it became a bit of an attention-grabbing headline that I'd done some kind of swap deal to sign Leonardo Sierra.
Per Leonardo Sierra.
Che Leonardo Sierra ha vinto con una fuga a lunga gittata. Bravo Leonardo, sorride anche. Giro votate per chi volete, ma votate.
Caduto 2 volte, ha saputo rialzarsi in entrambe le volte e poi è arrivato e ha vinto alla prima.
He won that stage having crashed twice. He crashed twice, managed to get up, won at Aprica, and then went on to finish 10th in the Giro as a neo-pro. That year he had the mentality of someone who wanted to use cycling as a kind of social elevator. He came from a family of very humble means. His dad had deserted them and the mum had raised 4 kids on her own. I got to know the mum well, the brothers, the sister, and he'd had a really hard childhood, which wasn't the case of Egan Bernal or another great Venezuelan talent I signed later and who happened to come from the same pueblo as Leonardo, Jose Rujano. But as I said, in 1990, Sierra looked destined for great things. He really wanted to earn a lot of money, and so he really applied himself, as he also did in 1991. That year he won a stage and the GC in the Giro del Trentino, and was 7th at the Giro d'Italia. So his career was very much following an upward trajectory, but then clearly he wanted to start enjoying la bella vita, which a footballer can afford to do, but a cyclist
possono
cannot.
fare la bella vita. E poi possono essere talenti in campo.
So that was our old friend Gianni talking about Leonardo Sierra, who at that point, the 1990 Giro, looked destined for great things. Gianni there even drawing parallels with Egan Bernal. Unfortunately, he didn't really go on to scale the same heights that Bernal already has. The Giro, as far as Gianni Bugno was concerned, was pretty much done and dusted at that point, chaps. He won again in the time trial, mountain time trial to Sacromonte di Varese. And then the Giro rolled into Milan. It was a Milan that was getting ready for the World Cup. Great euphoric scenes in Piazza del Duomo in Milan, and Bugno's coronation, having led the Giro from start to finish.
I'm lucky because I am from Milan. I've been born and I live a few hundred meters to the Vigorelli Velodrome, one of the most important places in cycling history.
Hello, I am Filippo Kautz and I'm the co-founder of Bidon web magazine, and we published 5 books about cycling in the last 5 years.
So I took the habit to go to the final stage of the Giro. It was my father brought me in the first years, and then I started to go me alone, and I did it every year. Every year I was in Milan, and in that week I went to the final stage of the Giro, to the final arrival. And I remember that one in 90 when Bugno won. He took his pink jersey and threw it to the people, and there wasn't not so many barriers like now. People, it was a huge crowd just under the podium, and there was something like people fighting each other to keep the jersey. And finally they broke it in pieces, and every one of those took a piece of that pink jersey. So it was shared. The gift was shared, and also my brother got a small piece of that pink jersey.
And Mario Cipollini won in Milan, Daniel, to complete a sort of Italian triumph. 12 out of 20 stages won by Italians in that Giro. So after 3 disappointing years, it was a really triumphant Giro for the Italians, kind of setting up a triumphant summer, didn't it? Not just with Football World Cup, but I'm thinking Claudio Chiappucci as well then emerged at the Tour de France and was Greg LeMond's closest challenger there.
It was, as far as most people were concerned, the start of it was going to be a great career for Bugno and Gino Bartali, we mentioned earlier. He tipped Bugno to go and win the Tour de France. That didn't happen. You know, when you speak to Gianni Bugno about it now, he's quite sort of sheepish about the whole thing. He doesn't really like revisiting that Giro all that much. I've spoken to him about it on numerous occasions, and I did again a couple of weeks ago. Unfortunately, a little preface to this interview: Gianni had been sick. I didn't really realise this at the time, and I was informed later that he'd been in hospital a couple of days earlier, so he sounded a little bit groggy, even less expansive about that 1990 Giro than he had been in the past.
Sì, non è che ho tanti ricordi.
I don't have many memories of it. There are nice memories, yes, but none that really stand out. I suppose one thing to say is that the previous 3 Giri had been won by foreigners. We were experiencing a bit of a low in Italy as far as stage races were concerned. Cycling was developing internationally, and some of the foreign teams were becoming better organised than we were. PDM, for example. These were big teams with massive sponsors, and they were buying up all of the best riders. It was hard for us to compete. At the Giro, I just wanted to take the jersey and keep it as long as possible. The prologue was dead straight, perfectly suited to me, and I managed to put everything through the pedals and win. None of the other favourites had even mentioned me in the build-up, but that's just part of the game. Look what happened. I thought I could keep the maglia rosa for a few days, but then we got to Vesuvius, and it was just a great stage for me. Napoli, big crowds, the volcano, it was all just beautiful. At this point, I was just trying to stay focused. I wasn't paying attention to the newspapers or what anyone was saying. The only thing I was reading was the Garibaldi. I was excited, sure, but I tried to treat it like any other race. Fignon had crashed on the stage to Teramo in the first week. He pulled out a few days later, and that left Charlie Motte as my biggest rival. The Pordoi stage was going to be the acid test, and I made it through.
Il Pordoi era la prima parte più importante.
One man who did have a little bit more to say about the 1990 Giro and the experience of winning that Giro was one of Gianni Bugno's teammates, Stefano Zanatta.
I am Stefano Zanatta. I was a teammate of Gianni Bugno in 1919 in the Giro when Gianni Bugno won the Giro.
He'd already won the Giro del Trentino, but there was a big difference between that and winning the Giro. We knew he could start well, but he'd never shown a level of endurance which suggested he could last for 3 weeks. In fact, he won the prologue, and I remember our meeting the next morning with our team manager, Gianluigi Stanga. He said, "So what do we do now?" We all looked at each other as if to say, "What do you mean, what do we do? It's not like we're going to win the Giro. Might as well keep the jersey as long as possible." That was our frame of mind, but it just sort of escalated. We grew in confidence. He went well on Vesuvius, and although we lost Vittorio Tebaldi, we just kept putting stages behind us like bricks in a wall. Then it got to the halfway point, he was still leading, and suddenly winning became the goal. Fignon was the big pre-race favourite, and I got to know him well later at Gatorade. He and Gianni were polar opposites. Gianni had this crippling insecurity. He never started a race thinking he could win, even though he was capable of it 80% of the time. He was always anxious, afraid of something or someone. Our job was to reassure him constantly. His self-confidence was not great at all, especially at the start of his career. He'd spend hours studying the Michelin Atlas, trying to identify places where it could go wrong, even on completely benign days, as though every bit of road was a sector in Paris-Roubaix. It was a kind of neurosis. Whereas Fignon had bags of charisma. He told you what to do, he decided. He also listened, but he basically jumped out of bed in the morning and said, "Right, this is how the race is going to go, this is who will be strong," and so on and so on. He did his homework too, but only up to a point. He basically trusted himself and the team to deal with whatever the route threw at him.
Ma neanche tantissimo, perché poi si fidava di se stesso, della squadra. Sai, noi essendo la squadra con la maglia.
You're in the spotlight much more when you've got the pink jersey in your team. Everyone was football mad, but we wanted to show the country that we existed too. And we did get a lot of attention. People were sat in front of their TVs all day. You were getting a lot of calls, a lot of requests. The other thing is that when an Italian takes the pink jersey straight away, there's always more interest. Especially when it's a young lad with a lot of promise, as was the case with Gianni. He won the prologue, Giovanni Fidanza won the next day, and you had an Italian team leading the Giro. Everyone in Italy was suddenly waking up, excited to see these Italians take on the foreigners. That was the script, and also how it turned out. Had a foreigner been dominating, I'm sure the press and the fans would have started drifting away and getting lost in the World Cup build-up. Maybe they did to a certain extent, but we were in our bubble and didn't even feel it coming really. On balance, I think people considered it a pretty memorable Giro, and then it was time for the World Cup.
Well, it's clear that cycling changed in the early 90s. It's just not entirely clear exactly what point that was, but clearly EPO was on the scene around about this time, if not in 1990, certainly by 91, 92, 93. I mean, I mentioned Joachim Halupchuk, the Polish rider, a little bit earlier. I mean, he was one of Bugno's closest challengers over the first half of the race, fell away in the time trial, but tragically died at the age of 25 in 1994. And there were lots of stories about whether or not EPO had played a part in his death, and certainly a lack of knowledge about, heart conditions in riders. There was a spate of riders who died in that period in the 90s, wasn't there? And so it's impossible to divide one from the other, really.
It is, Napalm, it really is. And, 1990 was a bit of a tipping point, I think, a bit of a watershed. We don't know whether it was around about that time that EPO became de rigueur, or whether it was only certain riders or who had access to it. Is that why the Italians suddenly started thriving in the early 1990s? They've been talk in the past about Bugno and his links to Italian doping doctors, Francesco Conconi and Michele Ferrari. Above all, Ferrari had worked for Chateau d'Ex, but he'd fallen out with the team. He'd fallen out with the team manager, Gianluigi Stanga, during the 1989 Tour de France. He'd left the team. Was Bugno working with Conconi in 1990? I asked Gianni that a couple of years ago. He was adamant that he wasn't in 1990. He did work with Conconi in 1993. You think about 1990 Giro. Could Bugno have been patient zero as far as EPO is concerned? Or conversely, could it have been a case that Bugno was penalised by lots of other riders taking EPO thereafter? And is that why he never went on to repeat the same exploits that he'd pulled off in the 1990 Giro? That is an intriguing question when EPO did come onto the scene. I've spoken quite a lot about this to Sandro Donati, who was a famous Italian researcher who wrote this dossier in 1994, sort of blew the whistle on EPO, the EPO plague in the peloton. And Donati thinks that 1988 and the spring or summer of 1988 was the time when Conconi in particular might have started using EPO and ditching blood transfusions. Conconi, I think everyone knows and everyone acknowledges, he'd been using blood transfusions with the likes of Francesco Moser before that. But as far as Bugno is concerned, we simply don't know. I mean, Donati himself said that he'd heard Bugno was one of the, if not the most talented rider of his generation, and even later might have been using a lot less doping, if indeed he was doping, than other riders. But Bugno himself, when you ask him why he didn't reproduce the heroics of 1990, you're left pretty much none the wiser, as I was a couple of weeks ago.
Tuo padre aveva pianto tutti I giorni?
My dad cried every day in that Giro, as far as I remember. He certainly did during the presentation in Milan on the last day. It was pretty special, because it was the first time in quite a while that the Giro had finished in Piazza del Duomo. Was I ever as strong again after that Giro? I don't know. There were other times when I was strong, but it didn't all fall into place. I couldn't get the jersey, and I was on the back foot all the time, even if my form was good.
I mean, I don't think anybody could suggest that the guy whose parents owned a laundrette could be anything other than sparkling clean. Could they?
Boom, boom.
It's interesting. Charlie Motte's comments that you relayed earlier are interesting, aren't they, to sort of study those and look at possible subtext. The other aspect to that being Motte himself had a reputation throughout that period as a clean rider, as somebody who had refused doping products, and but at the same time was never really seen as a potential Grand Tour winner. I mean, he'd have been as unlikely a winner of that Giro as Gianni Bugno, and he was second in the end.
But I think we've got to put some context to the era as well, because unlikely Grand Tour winners were the phrase wasn't as well known back then, was it? The Giro and the Vuelta weren't referred to as Grand Tours. That's a much more recent affectation, really. It wasn't unusual for riders to sort of come out of nowhere, burn brightly, win a Grand Tour, a Vuelta or a Giro, and then not reproduce that. Well, we did a whole episode on the supernovas.
Well, 86, 88 and 90 all won by one-time Grand Tour winners.
Well, Daniel, that's the song of the summer 1990. Many happy nights having watched sport in 1990. Nessun Dorma, sung by Pavarotti. No disputing that it was the soundtrack of that entire summer.
Actually not, Napalm. Not if you were in Italy. There was a song, and it was about nights. So Nessun Dorma, no one sleep. But it was a different song, and it was also about nights that was really the soundtrack of the summer in Italy.
Well, there was an official song, which I don't think anyone outside of Italy heard, which was done by Edoardo Bonato and Gianna Nannini, who are two very big rock stars in Italy. And they sang it. I remember them singing it on the pitch in San Siro before the opening game. It was all a bit not very well organised and slightly weird, and they were standing in the corner. But it became this thing that, I still can't get it out of my head. Very catchy. I could do. I'm not going to, because everyone will turn off. But I could sing it for you, and it went right into my brain, and I think it did for lots of people.
Notti magiche inseguendo un gol.
Notti magiche inseguendo un gol. No, okay. Thank you. Sorry, it's not possible because I am not able to sing. When I was at elementary school, and we had singing in the chorus, I only moved my lips because I am not able to sing.
Notti magiche, inseguendo un gol, sotto il cielo di un'estate italiana, e negli occhi tuoi voglia di vincere un'estate, un'avventura in più.
So our friends Amara Terra there. Just briefly on Pavarotti. Anybody see the Pavarotti document directed by Ron Howard?
I haven't.
Is it good?
It's really good. It's fantastic. What a larger-than-life fellow he was, surprisingly enough. But we're sort of wallowing in a bit of nostalgia here, looking back to 1990. We can all remember 1990. I don't want any mention of Costa Rica in this section.
Well, no, but
that's my only request.
What I will say, I mean, Daniel won't appreciate this because, of course, I was following cycling through the deeply uncool prism of British cycling and Cycling Weekly. I mean, what you've got to bear in mind is that when the 1990 Giro was on, the whole of the front bit of Cycling Weekly was all about the milk race, which was won that year by...
You're going to start talking about Gaza in a minute as well, aren't you? I've no idea about the milk race.
Shane Sutton.
Shane
Sutton won the 1990 milk race. There's a great anecdote about Shane Sutton that I can only tell in our live events when they happen from that milk race. But the World Cup was, everything about Italy was cool, wasn't it? The blue shirts, the football stadia looked fantastic. Even, when you watch the World Cup at home on TV, and you got little glimpses of Italy, it looked like an impossibly cool place. So you have to plant Bugno's Giro victory and the renaissance of Italian cycling, however it was fuelled, in that landscape, really, don't you?
And, Napalm, the fact that it happened, so the presentation in Milan was only 2 or 3 days, was it 3 days before the first game of the World Cup, which was going to be Argentina-Cameroon. And Argentina were the defending champions in the World Cup. They were based in Milan, and the Giro finish had been moved to midweek so as not to clash with the first game of the World Cup. But Maradona, I understand that, so it was Torriani and Castellano. I think Vincenzo Torriani, the long-time Giro boss, was sort of in the process of passing it on to Carmine Castellano that year, and they had tried to get Maradona to come to Milan to give Gianni Bugno the jersey, and they hadn't managed to do that. But yeah, really in those days before the kickoff of Italia 90, Italy was in a pretty euphoric state.
I think Milan felt a little bit left out of some of it, and there's always that rivalry between Milan and Rome, and I think Rome was very much the centre. And you think, of course, what do people remember about that World Cup? They're taking away Gaza and everything, but what do people remember about the kind of framing of it? They remember the three tenors in the Caracallabaves, and that was Italy, right? Even though 2 of the singers were Spanish. But anyway, let's not go there. But that was the kind of that. I mean, the audience for that was astronomical, right? And Pavarotti singing was the soundtrack, and I think it really did put Italy on the map for tourist wise as well. As obviously Italy's always been a big tourist destination, but it really went mega then. And I think Milan felt, we've got the opening game, but we don't really want Maradona. Maradona was hated, right? So they loved, it was bizarrely, they loved Cameroon beating Argentina. They were all supporting Cameroon because they hated Maradona more than they hated black people, which is saying something. But they got a bit left out, Milan. They didn't get a new stadium. They got a kind of new roof, which no one really liked and kind of ruined the grass for the next 5 years. And they didn't get, the big games. They didn't get any Italy games. And so I think, Milan people went about their business, whereas I think in other cities it really did take over daily life, especially as Italy got closer and closer to the catastrophic semi-final in Naples, not in Rome. There's also the fantastically bad mascot, Ciao, who was subject of lots of satire of, being kicked in the balls and different visions of Ciao, who was a kind of, I don't really know what he was. He was a sort of Lego man or woman with a ball head, and there were lots of other things with genitalia put onto him and things like that. So there was actually a vote to what name he was going to have. I keep saying he's a he, it doesn't have to be a he. And I remember voting in this because you voted via Toto Calcio, which was the pools. And it was the 3 alternatives, which I've never forgotten, were Ciao, Dribbly, and Bimbo. Right, so luckily for Italy, Ciao won, because I think if Dribbly or Bimbo had won, that would have been a bit catastrophic in the terms of translation. Bimbo just means boy, but not abroad.
Sì, decisamente era uno dei...
It was definitely one of the best periods for Italy. Sometimes a population gets swept up by an event. They see themselves represented or reflected in the protagonists. They have this sense of being a part of something big and collective. And very often they do this in an effort to forget in difficult times. But here it wasn't that. It was totally different. The Italians allowed themselves to be caught up in this euphoria partly because they were so carefree at the time. The economy was in a position we couldn't even dream of now, and everyone, I mean everyone, felt that they were a part of it. Magic nights going for goal, Gianna Nannini. It somehow just captured the mood, captured a sense of togetherness.
Il sentimento collettivo della gente.
That was Gianni Savio and John Foot. Gianni Savio, of course, a keen footballer. There's a link between Gianni and Italy going out of the World Cup, because Gianni for years, he used to have a tradition where he would present a bicycle to the top scorer in Serie A, which was the Italian top division, every year. And the first person to receive this, Gianni used to call it La Bici del Goleador. The first person was Paolo Rossi, who was the top scorer in the 1982 World Cup. And Gianni claims that he used to play against Paolo Rossi in his youth. Anyway, in 1990, well, the top scorer in Serie A the previous year was a player called Aldo Serena. And Aldo Serena was going to miss the penalty which put Italy out of the World Cup against Argentina. But before that, it'd been a real sort of festival in the whole of Italy, as often happens with these, big tournaments. A whole sort of nation seems to come together, as Gianni said there. And, it reminded me a lot, thinking back to what John Foote said at the start of the podcast about the political situation in Italy and how Italy was sort of surfing this wave of not just prosperity, but kind of coolness in the way it was perceived in the outside world. It reminded me a bit of Euro 96 and England. And, you think about the sort of music. It wasn't my cup of tea, but Britpop and Tony Blair. And, Britain had never really felt sort of more on vogue than it did then.
Just, you mentioned penalty misses and the number 17. I didn't know the number 17 was unlucky in Italy, but the other player to miss a penalty in that semi-final against Argentina was Roberto Donadoni, who wore the number 17 jersey. I mean, what an extraordinary way to kind of bring our story full circle.
And, as long as Italy were winning, everyone was sort of remained in that state of giddy excitement. And we talked about we've heard the song, the Notte Magiche, Magic Nights, and this became an almost literal thing. The first game against Austria, Italy won 1-0 with a late goal from Schillaci, and the policing was so bad and so chaotic that it took the people who were in the stadium until 3 o'clock in the morning to get out, and it was the middle of the night, and hence this Notte Magiche, this Magic Nights, became doubly appropriate. And there were many of them. It was mainly centred in Rome because that was where the Italian team were based, and the fact that the semi-final was against Argentina and Maradona was going to be played in Napoli, and Napoli was where Maradona was playing his club football, that almost presaged the disaster which then followed when Italy were knocked out and Serena missed his penalty. After that, it was almost as though the sort of balloon was deflated, that the whole balloon, the boom that Italy had been enjoying for several years or for the previous decade, it almost seemed to end with that penalty miss.
There were some very memorable moments for the Italians. Schillaci was something that, the arrival of this guy who wasn't very good and then suddenly becomes a national hero and scores every time he touches the ball. That was fantastic. And that no one expected him. He was like fourth choice or something. He wasn't even fourth choice. He wasn't even meant to be in the squad. So that was amazing. Baggio's goal against Czechoslovakia, I think, is something that everybody, it's one of the great goals of World Cup history. And Baggio should have been played more, and he was underplayed, and he didn't start the semi, as far as I remember. I may be wrong about that, but memory fades. It's a long time ago. But I think there were some great moments, but the actual football was pretty poor. Not by Italy necessarily, but there were some of the teams that there wasn't a high level. I think Germany were good, obviously. I mean, they weren't amazing, but they had some very good players. But yeah, it wasn't an amazing tournament from that point of view. And of course, Italy didn't win it. And I think that of course they should have won it. It was not just because they were the home team, but because they were the best team and that they played the best football. And they had an incredible amount of talent, actually, going way down. You think of Giannini, Donadoni, it was a very talented team. Zenga didn't give away a goal until the semi-final. I mean, they were just miles better than anyone else, but then it was just that Maradona game.
Dal dischetto Maradona, segna 4 tiri, 4 gol per l'Argentina, e va Serena a tirare dal dischetto. L'Argentina è finalista in Coppa del Mondo. Sono immagini che non avremmo mai voluto commentare.
And I think then quickly losing, the money that went on it, the stadiums that were terrible, thinking of Torino's stadium's already been knocked down, where the Gaza game was, and Bari's stadium, which is beautiful, but is completely bonkers. I don't know if you see it, Renzo Piano, it's now completely falling down, and they don't know what to do with it, and it's got no shade. So there's I think the sourness about it, and it doesn't become the memory. 82, 2006, 1970, even the semi-final. 1990 kind of fades away, apart from the Scalacci and Baggio things, I think.
Sotto il cielo di un'estate italiana e negli occhi tuoi.
And just a footnote, chaps, a couple of footnotes to what John was saying there. You mentioned the 1992 scandals in Italy, the whole sort of Italian political system collapsing, the mafia. It was sort of the bloodiest period in the mafia's history. The two famous anti-mafia judges, Borsellino and Falcone, were murdered that year. And when you talk to Italians about that World Cup now, there's a real sort of bitterness about the whole thing, the sense that it was a real missed opportunity, that Italy had never had it so good, and didn't realise, that was a tragedy of it, they didn't realise going into that summer of 1990 that things had never been better and would never be better.
Certainly was a missed opportunity, that World Cup, being drawn in a group with Costa Rica, Sweden and a kind of below par Brazil. But that's a whole other story.
You mentioned there the Italian fans struggling to get out of the Olympic Stadium in Rome for hours. I mean, that sounds like the evacuation at the end of a mountain stage at the Giro. Everyone's stuck in a cable car, waiting to get down. Magic nights indeed, eh?
And there was a moment when they did get knocked out against Argentina in Napoli. There's a famous Italian commentator, Bruno Pizzul, and the camera sort of panned to the Bay of Naples, and he said, "Oh, isn't the Bay of Naples looking beautiful tonight?" And he was absolutely pilloried for this. How could he talk about how beautiful Naples looked when the whole nation was in mourning? It was a national scandal.
Well, they do national scandals quite well, the Italians, don't they?
Well, chaps, should we wrap up stage 9 of our Giro? We're on the eve of a rest day. Well, there are no rest days on our Giro, I don't think. What's coming up tomorrow?
Well, we have got a rest day, Rich, but we're in the centre of Italy, or we're going to be making our way towards the Abruzzo region and L'Aquila. That was the venue, the location I chose for our rest day. And we're going to be talking to Richie Port, who enjoyed a fantastic day in L'Aquila in 2010.
Well, until then, thank you very much, Daniel.
Thank you, Rich.
Thank you, Lionel.
Thank you, Richard.
And playing us out tonight, another song, this time from our old friend François Thomazeau.
Lasciatemi cantare con la chitarra in mano, lasciatemi cantare, sono in italiano. Buongiorno Italia, le spaghetti al dente e un partigiano con presidente. Con l'autoradio sempre nella mano destra, in canale spacco la finestra. Buongiorno Italia con i tuoi artisti, contro America sui manifesti, con la canzone, con amore, con i cuori, con chiudoni sempre nella storia. Buongiorno Italia, buongiorno Maria, con gli occhi pieni di malinconia. Buongiorno Dio, sai che ci provo anch'io. Lasciatemi cantare con la chitarra in mano, lasciatemi cantare una canzone piano piano. Lasciatemi cantare perché non sono fiero, sono uno italiano, un francese vero. Well, this is a famous Italian song by Toto Cutugno. It was probably the number one hit in France as well. Great song about the pride of being Italian. Well, the last word I said, I'm proud to be French. I'm a true Frenchman. But yeah, this was my contribution to Giro. Giro is an Italiano vero. I'm not, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Giro. My pronunciation of Italian was probably very bad, and it might sound very strange for you to hear me sing this song. But I really wanted to do it. I tried my best. There might be a little bit of French there, a little bit of Spanish around here, but there you are, l'Italiano by Toto Cutugno for our Giro.